Gansu province is located in the northwestern part of China. This place had fertile land, was rich in various minerals, and the main advantage of this place was the Silk Road that passed through it. The Silk Road was a road that connected East Asia with the Mediterranean in ancient times and the Middle Ages. The Metal Knights fought with the Guyyu Bridge for supremacy in Gansu. These fighters were trained professionally in an academy called the Metal Flag League. There were a lot of students in this academy, and now they all stood in lines and performed hand-to-hand combat techniques. Their teacher was a burly man with red hair that stuck out randomly in different directions, Grover Brown. He instructed his students, saying that no matter what weapon they use, hand-to-hand combat is the basis of all martial arts. Because a weapon is just a tool that you use to strike or be struck. The students continued to practice the movements, practicing them to perfection while the teacher was talking. Among them was a boy with long hair, which was tied in a high ponytail. His eyes were the same color as his hair, light brown, and he had a small scar on his face under one eye. His name was Noamore. Each of those present listened attentively to the mentor and trained hard. He motivated them with their own lives, saying, "If you don't want to lose it, train hard." The guy was older than Noah, bigger too, but he was training with him. He had darker skin and short dark hair. His name was Liam. Grover gave the command to rest and everyone fell to the ground from fatigue. One of the imitators raised his hand to question Grover. It was Liam. He asked why they were practicing their fighting skills if they were going to face an opponent, Master Murim, who threw swords from long distances and hit the target. The teacher replied that they would certainly not be able to stand up to him in a one-on-one fight, because they were too low in rank. But such famous masters have a weakness that they don't have. Lean, impatient and curious, asked what this weakness was. With a smile on his face, the teacher replied that it was popularity. Lean did not understand what the point was, and it was clear that a famous person is popular, but how could this be a weakness? Grover replied that popularity shows which martial art your enemy is proficient in and what weapons they use. This is very useful to know when fighting such an opponent, so you can increase your chances of survival. They will know their opponent, and he will not know them. The teacher said in all seriousness that this was the only way to beat a master with a level as low as theirs. He added that this afternoon they would have the opportunity to study the Geiger masters. The students were not happy about this news at all, especially Liam, who opened his mouth. He said with irritation that they were still learning something at that age. Noah giggled, and the latter turned red as a tomato with anger and began to shout at the recruit for hearing such a funny thing, and the boy flinched in surprise. It was a bright day outside, the clouds were crawling across the sky, and busy people were walking around the market buying whatever they needed. Noah came to this market. He really liked the sword. Its hilt was blue with a snakeskin pattern and a red ruby that sparkled in the sun. The boy began to salivate as he looked at the sword, and the seller decided to interest the buyer. He said that the young man had eagle eyesight to notice such a wonderful sword that had come here from the west. The man decided to impress the boy by saying that this sword had been stuck in a stone for a long time. There was even a legend that whoever could get the sword would become king. The strongest men in the world were coming to fight with it. But ironically, only an ordinary boy was able to draw the sword. And indeed, after that he managed to unite the people and become king. Noah was fascinated by the story and asked hopefully if it really happened. The man smiled and said yes, and assured him that even he could become a king with such a sword. The boy believed him and asked in a nervous voice how much it cost. But then a voice shouted that a king with such a toy would become food for the crows if he went to the battlefield. The seller turned with an angry look in the direction of the voice. There stood a young boy with blonde hair and a high ponytail. Some strands fell out of the ponytail and fell on his face. He was holding a sack, but what caught my eye the most was the sword hanging behind him. Its handle was in the shape of a snake with evil eyes and the blade was wide. The man indignantly asked how the boy would comment on the sword's toe, which could harm not only a pig but also a person in a peaceful area. And the guy said with a completely indifferent look that it didn't matter who was in charge, it could hurt anyone. The salesman got angry and said that he wanted to destroy his business, standing on the table and grabbing the sword he was showing off to Noah, who was shocked by this development. The unidentified man asked him with a smile if he was threatening him and if it would change the value of his toy if it got a few scratches. The man jumped at the boy with the sword and shouted that it was not a toy. There was a loud bang, and the unknown man pulled out his sword and stabbed the other man. One blow broke the sword as if it had been cut in half. The boy put his sword back in its scabbard and asked Noah where the metal flag was. Noah was surprised to hear the direction of the road, pointing in the right direction. The boy asked him if anything was wrong, but he just ignored him and walked towards the metal flag, only noting how lucky he was. Lim came to a storeroom and asked the elder what he was reading, and without looking up from the text, he said, "The Art of War." The boy asked if he and his grandson had quarreled over a fight, and the old man replied that the laws in the book were not only about fighting, but also about wisdom, how to save lives. The boy did not really listen to the old man's words. He asked to borrow a sword, because you never know when you will get a knife in the back, and he did not want to wait for it. The elder asked the boy what kind of sword he needed, one that would allow him to defend his life or one that would allow him to take someone else's. The boy answered fiercely, baring his teeth, saying that he wanted it small and as good as possible. An unfamiliar guy came to Metal Flags and said he didn't know, and the shocked secretary asked him if he was from a family. The boy replied that he was an illegitimate child, and this embarrassed the man. After some thought, the secretary asked what school he had attended, and the boy replied that he had not. The secretary asked if he really had no family or education, and he answered in the affirmative. The man did not know what to do with him, and then Grover Brown and a man with a lot of scars on his face, his name was Michael, came into the room. The secretary asked if they were the ones who said they needed new recruits. He said that this guy came here on the recommendation of General Jones. Grover asked him to introduce himself, and the guy said he was Dylan, asked his last name, but Michael noticed how the guy's sword was positioned and asked if he was left-handed, and Grover also switched to Michael's conversation. Without saying a word, the guy simply demonstrated how he held the sword. Michael asked why he was holding the sword like that, hiding it back, and Dylan replied that it was comfortable. They exchanged incredulous glances, and that ended their conversation. The scene moved to the elder's cell, and Liam told them about Kevin, who was always going to the mountain and training hard. It looks like they will have to fight one day. He asked the elder if their team would participate in the competition, and he said yes. Liam complained that they didn't even have a coach, while shaving his head bald. Half of his hair was covered with a tattoo of a snake. Their conversation was interrupted by Grover and Michael, who brought Dylan's new coach to meet him. The room fell silent as Dylan looked around the room. Then a chubby boy ran into the room, shouting that he had brought dumplings, which he was holding in his hands. And when he saw Dylan, he stopped and pointed at him in shock, while everyone else looked on. That day was followed by the next. The weather was terrible. Black clouds were piled up in the sky, releasing lightning. All the people gathered in the dining room. Liam ate in tension. He did not like it at all. When Noah asked him what, he said that he did not like their mentor. Noah asked what was wrong, because in his opinion everything was fine. Liam asked how many times he had been here. Only 2, and he was joining this unit for the 8th time. Again, he asked if Noah remembered the previous commander, and Noah said yes, dejectedly. He looked up to Master Mirim, what a hero he was, and he went on to be honored forever. The new commander asked what if Liam died like a hero, and he replied that he was not a hero, but a warrior who came here for profit. But if he gave him a lot of money, Liam continued, to give him an incentive to risk his life, he promised not to say that again. Of course a low-ranking warrior like him would. The old man didn't let Liam finish and told him to chew his lunch in silence, while Noah was eating on both cheeks. The old man said it was more like dictating his terms to the new commander. Liam said that of course not, and said that he was very hungry for rice because it was delicious today, and began to shove it into his mouth. Noah asked him why he didn't like rice before, because he had never complained about it. He called the boy names and said that there was only one reason to feed a soldier well, and that was because there was a battle coming up. Now there is a meeting of the commanders-in-chief, where everyone is present, and a huge poster with the word, Resilience, written on it hangs in the hall. The chairman of the metal flag announced that the location of the Guiyun Bridge had been determined. The man looked expensive dressed, his hair was of an interesting color, some strands were gray and some black, and he had a beard. His name was Odin. Anthony, the right-hand man of the chairman, opened a map and pointed out where he was. He pointed to a place called Koz, where the forward base was located, a day's drive away. One of those present noted that they had already set 1 foot on the threshold of their territory. He was a man with short hair, he was not old at all, but his hair was completely gray. Another said that now there is nothing to wait for, if they know the location of the enemy, they should strike first. The chairman said that after 2 days of patrolling, each of the commanders would receive an order to be on full alert. He then turned to Michael and asked him to gather his men as a reserve unit, to which he nodded in agreement. A participant asked whether it was possible to gather people without the permission of the commanders. The chairman smiled and said that he understood what she was saying. Of course you can follow the wise decision of Chairman Ed Jones, but Anthony said that he ordered not to interfere, and even after explaining the situation he did not show up and thus showed disrespect. It was a beautiful morning, roses were blooming in the sun, it was the Jones family garden. Ed sat down and picked one of the roses, smiling. He brought it to his face to smell it, but for some reason he didn't like its smell. He looked at it with a cold look and cut off the head with his fingernail. It fell to the ground with petals. He smiled. Then he heard a voice. It was his sister, one of the participants in the meeting. She was young and beautiful, had a mole under one eye, had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and was dressed in an official uniform. His sister asked him irritably why he hadn't come to the meeting, and as he stood up, Ed asked if she could do anything without him. And she nervously asked if this was what the head of the Metal Knights would say. Ed replied that he did not become one because he wanted to, it was not his will. His sister got angry and called him very irresponsible. He said with his hands in the air that the only reason he was made leader was because he was the last son of his family, and assured his sister that if she were a man he would be the head of the Metal Knights, which seemed to be fine with her. In her mind she agreed with her brother's words, but she didn't say a word out loud, just opened her mouth. Ed went on to say that he was only sitting in the unwanted chair because he was born a man, and since she was born a girl, she couldn't get married until she was 30 and had to take care of him. The girl decided to just keep silent, biting her lip. They headed for the exit, but then someone called Ed, calling him young sir. It was some 3 girls, nervously saying they had been looking for him everywhere. He just smiled at them and hugged all 3 of them while the girls were talking and walked away from his sister. She just gave them a look and walked in the other direction. My sister went to the river. Jumping into it, she screamed with so much power. Having released her emotions enough, she got out of the water and sat on the ground. Then she heard a loud explosion, which scared her, and following the sound, she saw Dylan, who was training with a sword. He was not wearing any outer clothing, so all the scars he had previously received were visible. He spun like a spinning top in the air, slicing it with his sword. When he finished spinning, he stood upright and simply exhaled. He was breathing evenly, but his body was heaving, puffs of steam were hanging in the air, and he sheathed his sword. The girl saw this picture and was amazed and decided to approach him. She asked if he was made of metal. But he didn't say anything and started fiddling with the sword again. She noticed the sword he was holding and said it was incredible. This time he didn't ignore her, he stopped and said that it was his only friend. She asked him his name, and Dylan said that it was enough for him to call him a friend and put it back in its scabbard. But then the girl realized that it was not very warm outside, and without noticing it, she got cold and started shivering. The guy went to get his outerwear, which was hanging on a branch. He took it and came back to the girl and looked at her. While she was shivering from the cold, he was burning with heat, heating the air around him. She looked up at him. Dylan shook his cape to dust off the dust. She hoped he would help her, but the idiot just took his cape and walked away, and she was left standing in shock in the same place. She was not the only one in shock. Dylan went to the closet and saw Noah, Liam, and the elder. Noah informed him that the leaders were about to have a meeting. Dylan asked him his name, and he enthusiastically told him his name, and wished him a safe journey. Liam, I'm a hurt child, said that he couldn't even remember the names of the 9 team members. Noah decided to stand up for the commander, and said that he himself did not call him by his first name, but only by his recruit. Liam asked him if he didn't like the way he turned toward the other man, putting one foot on top of the other, and the latter furiously replied that of course he did not. Liam replied with insults, saying that he had heard this name from one of the girls in the places of bad behavior, and that they looked very similar. Noah was beginning to believe Liam's words, but he stood up and walked over to the boy and asked him what to call him now. Everyone was already gathered for a meeting, and Black Flag Chairman Michael was also present. Vice Captain John told the captains about the plans for the offensive. The Black Flag decided to take the first blow. He gave the order to leave without delay and to operate only at night. When everyone was dismissed from the meeting, one of the commanders approached Dylan and said that it was the first time he had seen him, asking if he was the new captain of the joke team. Dylan didn't answer, so he decided to be more polite and was glad to see him and stuck out his hand to greet him, introducing himself as the commander of the Heavenly Squad, William Clark. Dylan decided to ignore him and just walked past him. He was obviously not prepared for this and was very surprised. The man shouted that it was impolite to behave like that to a captain of such trash as he had been, and Dylan walked away and said that trash on the battlefield was much better than a hero who had lost his life. Day was replaced by night, a heavy downpour began, and the Dark Flag troops, along with other people who had been gathered from other teams, set out. Noah also left. Looking at the captain, he remembered their conversation. He came and said that he wanted to become stronger. Dylan replied that if he really wanted to do that, he had to survive. He said that being ready to give up his life would only make him weaker. To become stronger, you have to want to live. Noah was very much inspired by the captain's words and even blushed from such care, and then Liam crept up behind him. Now he was mocking him by calling him a she, saying that blushing seems even more attractive, and Noah squealed from such a surprise. The elder quickly put his hand over his mouth and gestured for him to be quiet. The boy tried to say something else, but the old man did not allow it. The soldiers set up camp in the meadow. Some of them were engaged in training, and some in keeping order and the situation around them. Grover spoke about the situation on the territory they were approaching. According to intelligence, only a third of the enemy army was there. Dividing the army into 5 detachments, he explained the plan of action, which provided that the first and second detachments would enter the enemy on the left, and all the other 3 on the right, showing this scheme on the stones. Grover asked the commanders who would lead the squads, and William nominated himself, but after some thought, the commander decided that the Joker's squad would take on the task. William was shocked by this decision and did not bother to argue, so Grover gave everyone the command to start. The commander was so insulted that they chose Dylan instead of him that he gritted his teeth. Dylan's team set out. They were walking a thin ribbon of road over a deep cliff between the mountains, each tied to the other by a rope on their waist. The old man was carefully monitoring the condition of the road and noticed that as soon as they touched the wall they were leaning on, it crumbled. He realized that such a loophole could be used as a route for a surprise attack. The old man thought about the fact that this plan had 2 sides to it: a successful ambush of the enemy, but you can also fall off the cliff and not come back alive. But then the ground under his feet cracked, opening a cliff below him. Noah flew down after the old man, but Dylan managed to stay on his feet. Liam did too, but it was harder for him. His veins popped out on his head from the tension and tightly clenched teeth. Noah was surprised and started screaming. Liam shouted at him to stop, because he could reveal their location and screw up the whole mission. Even if he fell to the ground, he had to keep quiet. Noah, with tears in his eyes, covered his mouth with his hand. They hovered over the cliff and Liam looked in Dylan's direction to see what their captain would do. Dylan pulled out his sword and Liam thought he was going to sacrifice the 2, but he slammed the sword into the wall, driving it into the wall for a stronger hold to pull them out. Liam was surprised by this behavior because he thought he was more tough. They got out by climbing the wall while they held the ropes, and Liam praised Noah for his uncharacteristic steadiness. Usually he would have screamed, but here he composed himself almost immediately. The old man apologized to the captain, who nevertheless thought, looking at the rope, that one or both of them were learning the guru's technique, which allowed the owner to move and jump very quickly because when he lifted them, their weight was very light. While they were solving their questions, he looked at them and said that sooner or later he would find out who it was. The old man turned to the captain when he turned away and mentally asked himself if he had not noticed, and said that at his age, he had a debt to fulfill. They continued on their way and soon arrived at their destination, a town at the end of their territory, where the enemy base was located. The village was devastated and destroyed. They went down the cliff and hid between the rocks. Dylan looked out and suspected that it was too quiet. He began to dictate the plan of the squad, which was that when the operation began they would begin to retreat. Noah was very surprised and asked if they were not the front line. Why were they retreating? Dylan asked if he wanted to become stronger, and he shook his head. Then the commander said to follow his instructions, which would save his life until he could become stronger. The boy was surprised, but said nothing, and they moved forward. It was still a dark night outside, the clouds here and there let the stars show, and the wind swayed the flags at the entrance to the city. The commander loudly announced the start of the operation and rushed toward the gate, and all the participants who were on his team followed him. Suddenly, he saw something, stopped abruptly and put his hand in a fist raised up, which meant stop, and ordered to press against the wall. He took the hilt of his sword and waited. Events shift to the other two squads. On the one hand, Michael's team checked the village. They did not meet a single living soul. On the other hand, they were joined by Grover's team, who also did not see anyone. Grover assumed that either the intelligence had given the wrong coordinates of the enemy, or the army knew they were coming, so they regrouped in another place. Michael ordered the two teams to retreat. Many arrows of fire flew in their direction, lighting their way in the darkness. One of the arrows, burning very brightly, leaving lines of fire behind it, flew to the side behind the wall where the squad was hiding. Noah panicked and asked if the commander had given the order to retreat. Dylan said not to worry, just to watch. And then they saw William's army, which seemed to be running away from someone. When the two captains met their eyes, they were surprised, because they did not expect to see each other. William was so carried away that he didn't see the stone he tripped over and flew face down, losing his weapon. The two exchanged angry glances, and the commander gritted his teeth at this unfortunate humiliation. He jumped to his feet and ran away from that shameful place with the speed of light. They exchanged glances, and the old man mentioned that there was a cliff, to which the commander remained silent. Dylan walked over and picked up William's weapon, saying that if they were caught crossing that path, their chances of survival would be 0. Noah offered to talk them out of it, but the commander objected, saying it was a waste of time. They wouldn't listen. They were scared now, so fear would take over and they would do everything to survive, to run away from the offender. Dozens of arrows again cut through the air and flew at the heads of the squad. Dylan, running away from the arrows, said that now, before the enemy launches the arrows for the third time, they need to break through his defense and strike. The head of the enemy army spoke up and said that this town would become a grave for all who would not lay down their arms and bow their heads before him. Suddenly William's spear, which Dylan had taken, flew in his direction, and the villain barely dodged the blade. Immediately behind him was Dylan's army, who shouted that anyone who stood in his way would fall and urged his subordinates to go forward, even if the enemy was advancing. The two armies entered the battle with equal chances, all raking equally from each other. Noah was screaming under the blade of a man who called him young, but before he could speak, the elder beheaded him. After that, Noah had an epiphany. Fear took over his body and he acted instinctively. The moon was already full when they finished with the enemy on the outskirts of the town and moved through the forest. Everyone was a little shaken up from the battle, but luckily everyone survived and some only got away with scratches. Dylan stopped everyone again with a fist-up gesture, and they ducked down to hide behind the bushes. The commander pointed to a large stone on one side of them. They walked behind it, and he said that for now it was their resting place, anyone who needed to have their wounds repaired, and the soldiers fell to the ground with exhaustion. But only Noah did not calm down. He was mumbling to himself and sweating from the heat and adrenaline that his body released in such a terrible situation. Liam noticed the boy and came over and slapped him on the back, calling him a good boy. But the boy was out of it. He took the blow as a threat and pointed the blade of his spear at Liam, who was not expecting it, so he stood in a stupor looking at the approaching blow, and then the tip hit the sword. The sword belonged to the commander. He said to Noah that he hadn't warned him about the body's response to stressful situations, but the boy came to and didn't seem to understand what was happening. Liam shouted at the boy and slapped him on the head again because he had frightened him. The elder came over and saw the wound on Noah's arm, determined that it was a spear, and asked how the boy had touched the wound, and he screamed and shuddered in surprise. Fortunately, the wound was not deep, so a bandage would suffice, and he helped to apply it, and the rest was just a scratch. It seems that the boy was not himself when he was fighting, so when he saw other blood on his hands, he was terrified. The elder asked him if he remembered anything, and he shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. Realizing what he had done, the boy was seriously terrified, twisted, and almost vomited with his hands over his mouth. Dylan noticed that this boy was also unusual. The old man went up to the commander who was watching the neighborhood and reported that no one was seriously injured. He also noted that they were the first to break out and asked when they would move on, to which the man replied, without taking his eyes off the trail, after the main forces arrived. The old man thought that they were hiding here not only from the enemy, but also so that the main army would go first on the offensive, except that if the enemy knew about their attack and prepared ambushes on the main battlefield, then most of the time they would also be on the retreat. They don't know where these traps are, so they don't know if he decided to send the main army first because of that. After thinking about it, the old man offered to join them. Dylan turned to him and asked if he wanted to become a hero, to which he received a negative answer. Of course, the old man did not need fame and asked if the commander thought the main army would be able to get out. Dylan answered seriously and confidently that their leader was no slouch. The whole town was on fire. It seemed as if the flames were reaching the sky. The head of the enemy army was shouting something, unbalanced. One of the soldiers, who looked like an overgrown orc, came up to him and told him to calm down, because the surviving soldiers could not run far. The unbalanced one agreed and smiled strangely. Horrible things were happening around them. Their soldiers were killing those who were still breathing, and he smiled at the opportunity to save the lives of others. The survivors got out and came to the retreat. Grover broke the arrows stuck in his back and looked at the people behind him. Not many soldiers survived, which was sad. The marshal looked ahead at the road and realized that there were traps, but they had no choice but to move forward. He urged the men to run as fast as they could. Grover spoke to Michael and told him that there were no ambushes in such a good place to escape, as they saw lights out of the corner of their eyes. There was an army waiting for them, and the group of survivors stopped. At the head of the enemy army was the third master of the Gaigu school, whose name was Stan. He was armed with 4 short swords attached to his arms, like Wolverine, and he was smiling at them with an evil smile. Michael prepared for the battle by drawing his sword. The third raised his hand to signal the archers, who raised their bows towards the army. The commander realized that they could not win this battle, so he came up with an escape plan. It consisted of a way to escape in the dark if they could extinguish the torches. The master spotted Black Flag Captain Michael. He had heard of his combat experience, and noted this event, urged them to surrender. If they did, no one would be hurt. Michael said that this negotiation was useless and rushed into battle. The archers shot arrows. Hundreds flew at the commander, who skillfully dodged them and continued to move towards the enemy. Michael did not intend to attack the enemy at first. He wanted to extinguish the torches, and when the master realized the captain's true intentions, it was too late. He caught the latter and threw him towards the third. Having repelled the attack, Stan did not expect to see another one. This time the commander aimed at the enemy. He stabbed him in the head with his sword and he managed to deflect it, and they started a fight. The other army also decided not to wait and rushed at the archers. They began to shoot arrows and could not keep up with the soldiers and were defeated. Grover helped Michael deal with Stan, buying time to escape. Some except the third on his feet after the fight and continued to shoot after them. He looked at them and became interested in the Black Flag captain. He wanted to meet him again. It was still a cloudy night outside. They had already left the mountains and were heading through the forest. Michael was hit in the side by an arrow, and it went deep enough that you could see the discomfort and pain it caused him as they ran. But he was not the only one who was severely wounded by an arrow. Almost every soldier could barely stand. Even though they were so injured, they could not stop and rest or get treatment. They had to find a safe place, so they continued on their way. Finally, they reached a crossroads in the forest and stopped for a rest. But Michael pulled out his sword and hit a rock, and everyone else reacted and saw the cavalry. They realized that in this situation they would not be able to escape, because the horses would quickly catch up with them. A guy on a white horse and light clothes rode out of the army in black and red armor on black horses. He did not fit in at all. He stood out too much from the crowd. Turning to the commander, Michael said that he was shorter than he had imagined and that the nickname, Destroyer of Souls, did not suit him at all. He had heard in his circles that Michael was one of the 10 strongest fighters in his land. The enemy took out his weapon, which looked like a chain with a blade-shaped tip, and he called it the silver chain of Seti's white horse, which he would have the honor of shepherding. Using it, he spun the chain as if it were the blades of a helicopter, and the force of rotation was very great. Grover asked for permission to deal with this enemy and Michael blocked his way, standing in a stance ready to strike. He, like everyone else, was too tired to fight, so even the sword in his hands was shaking. But the enemy was in the prime of his life, making circles in the air with his weapon, and suddenly Dylan's men began to make their way through the crowd. They hurried to help their comrades. Realizing that there was no other way out, if they didn't defeat the enemy now, he would pursue them until he killed every last one of them. Dylan shouted to destroy the commander and kill all his men and rushed into the battle, pulling his sword from its sheath. The old man reminded him of the commander's words that he did not want to become a hero, and he confirmed his words and said that he did not want to become a hero, but was trying to survive. Liam complained that they had run all night from them on their own and would ride away on their horses with victory. The white horse first decided to attack Noah. He was surprised and did not have time to react to the enemy's attack, but Liam caught up in time and closed him with his spear, which was wrapped in a chain. Liam thought he had him, but the horse kicked him in the breath and forced him to stand on his hind legs and pulled him toward him, and he staggered forward, unable to keep his feet, out of surprise. Seti began to turn around and pull Liam with him, and the latter began to shout not to joke with him like that and threaten that if he grabbed hold of him, he would hold him with his teeth and not let go. The enemy just smiled, turned his horse around and pulled the chain, dragging the boy with him. Despite his own threats, the boy surrendered and let go of the chain, after which he fell back to where the old man was standing. With one swing of the chain, he threw the weapon toward him, and when he caught it, he called it ugly. While the enemy was relaxing after such an easy fight, Dylan decided to sneak up on him, and one of his wards warned him. The enemy tried to attack Dylan, and he dodged the blow by stepping to the side and slipped into the horse's legs. While the guy was kicking the horse's legs, Mike decided to take a look at the enemy's fighting technique. It was uncertain due to the chaotic actions of the chain, which could easily change the trajectory. That's why the commander decided to kick the horse in the legs, but the horse's hooves could also cause a lot of damage. The boy was at great risk of suffering a fracture or bruises to his internal organs. Seti began to yell at the horse to run over the enemy, but Dylan drew his sword and swung at the horse, which, in defense of itself, raised its body, stood on its hind legs and threw off the rider, who could not hold on and fell loudly from the horse to his fifth point. One of the soldiers rushed to the master and was blocked by Noah, who poked his spear almost into the enemy's face. The latter jerked back, trying not to get caught on the blade. The guy claimed that he was his opponent. Dylan, meanwhile, remained face to face with the enemy, getting rid of the obstacle in the form of a horse that favored the enemy. The white horse fell to the ground between the two of them as they prepared for the fight, and Noah meanwhile took on the one who would interfere with a fair fight. The enemy decided to strike first at the commander, launching his chain at him. The speed of the movement was still impressive. It flew so fast that Dylan barely managed to get his head out of the way. He did not stop his attacks and continued to bombard Dylan with them, not allowing him to stay in one place for long. The commander jumped like a hare under the enemy's blows. But one of the blows he aimed not at him, but at his horse and hit him in the head with such force that it is not difficult to guess what was left of his head. Dylan was shocked by what he saw. Seti said with a smug grin on his face that it was his turn to show what he could do and twisted his weapon to make a shield. Dylan thought that the enemy might lose if he didn't twist his chain in the right way and rush to attack, dodging the periodic attacks in his direction. But he did not take into account that the enemy can use his arms and legs to wield his weapon. He saw a chance and kicked the chain straight into the heart of Dylan, who was not expecting it, and still managed to close with his sword, crossing his arms and taking a stable stance. It didn't help much, though, because the blow was so strong that it threw the commander a few meters away from the enemy. Even though he landed well on his feet, it was clear how much damage the blow had done. The enemy, who had not yet recovered from the first blow, decided to strike again, but this one was clearly stronger than the first. Without even unwinding the chain, he rose up and spewed out a huge force that could lift buckets around him and immediately struck. Dylan jumped back trying to dodge the blow. He was followed by another and another, which the captain managed to dodge. The enemy cheerfully said that he had made it much more interesting to fight. He asked how a low-ranking warrior who could easily sell his sword for good money, and who had no ideals or beliefs, could do this. Dylan did not answer his opponent, but was too exhausted to continue the fight. Noah could see that the commander was struggling and could not help, because he himself had an enemy who had just noticed that he was distracted and struck with his spear, but Noah noticed the movement behind his own spear out of the corner of his eye. The old man noticed the fight that Noah was engaged in and became nervous about the boy. He was fighting with a short spear against a long one, thus increasing his chances of defeat. Only it was not just the length of the spear, but the technique of striking. The attack from above is much stronger than the one from below. His opponent was on horseback, so he had many advantages in such a battle. To win such a battle, he needed to throw his enemy off the horse, as the commander had done. The old man advised the boy to attack the horse first. The enemy replied that he would not allow him to do so by attacking Noah again, but the boy dodged him and jumped to strike the attacker from above, and the attacker ducked to avoid the blade and then began to pull his horse to retreat, but when he looked back, Noah was nowhere to be found. He did not understand where the opponent had disappeared, but when he felt the enemy behind him, he pointed his weapon there and was surprised by what he saw. The boy used the guru technique by standing on the spear blade. The old man was amazed by such abilities, but for some reason the commander thought that the weight on the rope had decreased because of him. The warrior swung his spear, throwing down the enemy, and he landed calmly on the ground. The enemy was amazed at his abilities and asked what kind of person he was. Michael watched this battle from a distance, and he remembered the day they took him into their ranks. He was not the same as he is now. He looked gloomy, even more exhausted. Grover asked him who he was and what he specialized in. He answered that he worked with spears, and after asking who taught him this, he became even more upset. When Michael heard the name Moore, he realized that he belonged to a clan living in the forests. The enemy decided to get down from his horse and continue the fight on the ground with his own feet. Noah made the enemy think that his advantage was a disadvantage and that being at a height could be dangerous. He decided not to wait and strike first, ran at the guy and swung his spear to strike, but the guy deflected and struck his own combination of blows, turning circles with his spear like a true professional. Meanwhile, the battle between the commander and the master continued. Dylan tried to slip between the circles the enemy drew with his weapon, but the latter again used a trick with his foot to give the chain more force and speed. This time the guy could not quite dodge. The tip scratched his cheek. Without giving him time to recover and take a breath, the enemy waved his hand again, pointing the weapon. He pointed the tip directly at the head of the commander, who did not expect such a quick attack. He could not dodge, and the dagger hit him hard on one side of his forehead. Dylan fell to the ground after a few meters on his back, trying to stop, and kicked up a big pile of dust in the air. But he managed to stop, moved to his feet from the crouch, and tried to normalize his breathing by covering the wound with his hand. The wound was hidden under the strands of his bangs, so it was not visible how deep it was, but it was still bleeding heavily, blocking the view of one eye, which had to be closed because blood began to enter it and flowed down his face. The enemy was surprised to see the enemy survive such a strong blow to the head. He recognized the captain's endurance. But the talks did not last long. He said it was time to end the game and finish the fight by lowering his weapon for the next blow. He switched to serious intentions and released his trump card. It was the tip, which turned from a stake into something that looked like a flower with sharp ends. The blow left his mind blurry, and almost making him faint. The captain forced himself to stand on his feet and think about how to deal with the enemy. He analyzed the enemy's actions. When he hit from a long distance, the speed was such that Dylan could see and dodge the attacks, but as soon as he got closer, he stopped seeing the attacker's movements, and it was difficult to dodge such a fast attack. Dylan was thinking about a plan to shorten the distance but increase the size of the strike range, but with such a success he would simply be swept away on the road. It was dangerous to shorten the distance in this way, so he decided to do the opposite. He ran at the enemy, dodged the blow and took hold of the chain with his hand. If he could not get closer to the enemy, he would simply pull him to himself. He pulled the enemy toward him, who stumbled but did not lose his footing. He also had a chain under his other arm, so he took it out and untwisted it, already rejoicing in his victory. Seeing the other Dylan, he decided to throw his sword at the enemy, but of course the master managed to repel such an attack with his shield made of the spun chain, and said that throwing his only weapon at him was a foolish idea. He decided that it was time to end the fight, and struck what he thought was the decisive blow to the head. Behind the pile of dust, he could not see if he had hit his opponent, only saw blood spilling onto the ground, and the master decided that the fight was over and called it boring. Then the chain shook sharply and Seti was amazed at such resilience. He did not believe that the enemy was able to resist, and when he showed up it turned out that the flower had hit his hand. The old man understood the scheme of the enemy's weapon. Its blow is strong if it is spun for a second, reducing the radius and increasing the speed and thrown at a long distance. Then it gains such power, and if you spin it at once with a small range, it will not give it such a crushing force. Dylan, holding both chains in his hands, ran at the enemy screaming. Seti was nervous and didn't know what to do or where to run, and meanwhile Dylan took one of the chains and charged it at the enemy's head. After the blow, the master fell to the ground, blood poured from his head, and the commander continued to beat him with his own weapon, then dropped the weapon when he saw that the enemy was not moving. When the soldier saw his commander beaten on the ground, he began to shake with anger and shouted, directing his troops to the attacker. The troops flew at the enemy and Michael and Grover took them on. Grover said he was rested enough to take them on, but they looked the same, tired and had lost a lot of blood, mostly from arrows that had wounded them. Lean also joined the commanders. He was more lively because their unit was well rested and not so wounded. The boy shouted with fervor that he was ready to give his life today. The enemy horsemen rushed forward and began to fight, and the squad surrounded them and struck them from the side to knock them off their horse. Noah shouted and swung his spear to defend himself and to hurt the soldiers around him. The head of the soldiers shouted that they should attack the enemy directly and together to finally end this battle. But then a roar was heard. The enemy turned around and saw an army with the flag, steadfastness. It was the reinforcement of the main units that went on reconnaissance. The army was seeing off the dawn sun. Meanwhile, the chairman's right-hand man came to inform him of the situation at the front. Seeing Odin's face, he guessed that the news would be disappointing. Anthony said that the plan with the sudden capture of the enemy had failed. The Geiger's school knew immediately about the attack on them, so they were very prepared. Out of 207 participants in the battle, only 54 soldiers survived. All the rest were lost souls and missing. If the main cavalry had not arrived in time, no one would have survived, and after its arrival, the enemies cooperated and fled the battlefield into the forest. It was the worst operation the Black Flag had ever conducted, but despite such losses, the soldiers managed to defeat Master Seti. The chairman asked whether it was Commander Michael or Grover, and Anthony said it was just the usual Joker squad commander, Dylan. In total, 7 out of all 10 members of the squad survived. It was one of the squads that had a high survival rate. The chairman was interested in the commander. The right hand asked if he needed to dig for information on him, and Odin replied that yes, they might need him later. And the chairman went on to say that the operation was well planned. Only the members of the League knew about it. It was classified information, so one of them was a spy. The day came. All the people who had fallen after the battle were still lying in the same place, and a man climbed out of the pile of people. It turned out to be William. How he got there, how he was shot is not known. He did not understand what was happening. After looking around, he got down from the pile and went forward through the canyon between the mountains where the ambush and fight had taken place. The events are transferred to the enemy's territory. It was the place of the Red-Green Gap in the province of Gaigu, where the main headquarters was located. The place was unpleasant to look at, with the usual dull buildings and many businesses that emitted large amounts of smoke into the air, and something else burning heavily, filling the sky with red colors. A team of men surrounded a girl near the device. It was the deputy head of the school, Gaigu, who was able to repair it. They started it up and it worked. It was a device in the form of an elevator, which was used to bring coal out of the mine and lower workers down. The elevator arrived at the top and a short old man and strong men stepped out. The work continued. People were moving the wheelbarrows of coal along the rails to the right place and returning back downstairs. The old man said to one of the men that he was afraid to stay there, to which he said it was all thanks to the deputy head. She came up to them and told them that luckily it wasn't that bad and that if they had any more problems with the mechanism, they shouldn't hesitate to call her for help. She looked like an ordinary young girl with white hair, which was gathered in a long braid and did not carry any threat in its appearance. It turns out that she invented and built this mechanism herself. Then some girl ran up and called her, and by the worried look on her subordinate's face, she realized that something was wrong. She burst in and called her father, who was the emperor. He was quite old, as evidenced by the gray hair, but at the same time he had a strong, seemingly strong body. His name was Stan, and he addressed his daughter by the name of Camellia. She saw Seti's weapon on the table and was horrified. Cam cried, screamed in despair, not believing what was happening. Night fell on the world, and William approached the Black Flag League Hall, and when he saw the guards blocking his way with spears, he was outraged and shouted to them to tell them that he was the commander of the Heavenly Squad, William Clark. One of the guards exhaled and said that he knew who he was, so they removed their weapons and allowed him to step inside. In the middle of the warriors were talking about the new commander. According to gossip, he managed to defeat the master of the school, Seti. Hearing this, William was shocked. The warriors began to wonder how an ordinary squad leader could defeat one of the top 10 masters. Some agreed that he could not, and some were interested in how he did it, what techniques he used to do it. One shouted with delight that he heard someone say that he had killed him with his own chain, which was true. They enthusiastically began to praise the new captain, which William did not like at all. He silently turned and walked away. As he walked, he thought about how he had been treated with disdain and blatantly ignored, and when he reached the closet he heard voices. Inside was a group of jokers talking loudly to each other. The old man asked Dylan, while tending to his wounds, what if the commander was promoted after such a victory? The commander said that it was just a battle for life, and if he was offered a promotion he would refuse, because then he would lose the opportunity to escape. The old man said that he was also glad to have survived. For him, as a low-ranking soldier, it was more than enough, finishing applying bandages to Dylan, who agreed with the old man's words while kneading his hands in the bandages. William came to a room that was completely surrounded by the darkness of the night, and sat down on a bench. But he did not sit for long. A man came and said that the deputy chairman was calling him. Following the man sent for him, William was nervous and asked if he shouldn't have washed and changed before the meeting, which he ignored. He walked into the hall and greeted the deputy chairman, who gave him an evil look and asked the man who had brought him if it was him. And when he received a positive answer, he asked his right-hand man why he thought he dared to return after what he had seen on the battlefield. Anthony hypothesized that perhaps the man did not realize that his true identity had been exposed. William began to make excuses, saying that he had been thrown into the midst of the battle and had barely gotten out just now. Anthony interrupted him and said that they would conduct a full investigation and then find enough charges to force a confession. The subordinate understood the order, and William did not understand what he had to confess and wanted to say something, but the man grabbed him by the throat and lifted him above him. Still holding him by the throat, he was dragged out of the room, gasping for air, and William blushed. The chairman had ordered that the internal investigation to find the spy not be disclosed, and that the results not be discussed. Although this failed plan helped to expose and expel one of the commanders, the rat was still at large, which made Chairman Odin very angry. Odney asked how the investigation on Commander Dillon was going. Anthony replied that he was gathering reliable information and would bring back information about him during the day. The chairman said he was free to go. As he walked out the door, Anthony smiled evilly and confirmed his theory that the chairman was not a fool and realized that William was not a spy. A boy who studied with Dillon was asked what he knew about him. They had fought together during the Six Schools conflict. He did not know the art of sword fighting, but he fought well. Dillon had killed some good warriors from the Six Schools alliance in those days, and when asked how old he was, he said he was only 16. Another man said that he was quite famous in these circles because he had fought in many places, always carrying his nameless sword of a strange shape. The man was surprised that he was still alive because he used his technique without a name or origin. Asking the third man, who said that wherever he went, Dillon achieved great success, it was only strange that he was not promoted for such achievements. And the commanders never liked him, which may have been due to his look of disobedience. A fourth man, whom he clearly did not like, was interviewed and said that Dillon had killed 3 of the elders. Although he only knew basic fighting techniques, the sting was always on his side, and he miraculously defeated enemies who were much stronger than him. Once they gathered in a group and attacked him alone, thinking they had him cornered, but he disappeared like a ghost. Now, as long as Dillon is on their side, he tolerates it. But when he sees him on the enemy's side and threatens to kill him himself, the man shakes with anger. They asked a man with a strange expression on his face, and he smilingly recommended Dillon. This man's name was Simon. Anthony asked him to tell him more about this boy. This conversation was overheard by a girl of the Jones family. Surprisingly, when he knew little about him and recommended him, they met when Simon was seeing off the traders. One of the assistants came up to the guide and warned him that bandits were not uncommon on this road, so there might be a trap ahead. Simon replied that they should not worry, because they were protected by the Metal Flag League, and no bandits would approach them if they saw the flag. Another asked if this meant that if they lost something, the League would return it, to which his colleague elbowed him in the gut. Simon saw something up ahead and stopped the group. They cautiously approached and saw the defeated fighters. One of the group asked if they were bandits. Simon did not understand who they were fighting, and then one of the guards shouted that he had found a survivor. It turned out to be a badly beaten Dillon. The guide introduced him and asked what had happened. Pulling himself to his feet and spitting out the excess blood in his mouth, he said it was the bandits. Simon crossed and said that all that was left of the bandits were their bodies and asked who had done it. Dillon said that he was walking along the road when they came out, blocked the road and said they didn't like the way he looked. The shocked man asked if he had done it, and the boy replied that he had dealt with one of them, and then the others attacked. After they helped to heal his wounds, the boy wanted to thank his savior. Simon said that as a token of gratitude, he could join the Metal Flag League and defend them there. The guide could not have imagined that he would do so. And since the bandits were gone, they broke the agreement with the traders, but sooner or later new ones appear and they have customers again, and the deputy just smiled casually. When Simon left, The girl went up to Anthony and asked if they had talked about the new commander. He answered yes and said that the more you got to know him, the less you believed that he could defeat a top 10 master. The girl suggested that maybe he was just lucky, and Anthony thought about it and replied that if he was in such a situation, he was definitely not lucky. The girl said that even though he had a lot of problems, he was really able to overcome the enemy. Anthony agreed and said that he went into this one not knowing how much luck he had left, and with a smile said that now it was time to pay it forward. He was rewarded for his bravery by being given 10 silver coins, and Dylan replied that the league was too generous in rewarding him considering that he had just run away. Noah replied that he had earned them by defeating an enemy of such power. Liam interrupted Noah's admiration for the captain and said that it was good that he was left alive, because he was responsible for the failed mission. The boy began to defend the captain because the mission failed not because of his fault, but because of the leak, and their squad should not be held responsible for the misdeeds of the leaders. Then Dylan threw a bag of money at Noah and told him to go and buy meat and drink for the whole league, sending Liam with him to make sure the money wasn't stolen. He gave Noah a hug and called him a recruit in red and sent him on his way. It was a beautiful day outside, sunny and calm, and the only people left in the barn were the old man sterilizing used surgical instruments in hot water and Dylan, who was sharpening his sword. The old man saw the commander sharpening his sword for the first time and asked if he was sharpening his mind in the same way, and the commander remained silent and looked at the thinness and sharpness of the sword. The old man said that the meeting of the commanders was in full swing and he was worried about Michael and Grover. They had been hit hard by the enemy. At the meeting, Anthony announced the news that a spy had been found. It was William, and the captain from the Jones family asked if they were sure about it. He replied that he had confessed, but she did not understand why he was trying to do better for his country and building connections here. He was trying so hard to get promoted. Anthony pointed this out, and if he had been sitting among him, he would have had much more information. At that time, the guys went into the shop and Liam ordered drinks and top-quality meat. Noah got nervous and said that maybe they shouldn't buy such expensive meat, they needed to buy for the whole league. He reminded the guy that they were left with 50 people, 20 of whom were bedridden and could only drink porridge through a tube. The chairman replied that the spy was to blame for the failed plan to take the enemy by surprise, so he would not prosecute the Black Flag unit, but he would not allow any more replenishment. Grover was very outraged by this decision because, excluding the wounded, there were 30 men left in their team. Anthony suggested that they disband the unit and scatter the men among the others, and Grover had to grit his teeth. The elder noted that the meeting was not over yet if the commander had not returned, and Dylan said that it was clear why the mission had failed, because of the spy who had infiltrated their ranks. The old man noted that Dylan's face did not show that he was angry. The commander replied that he was not so simple-minded as to be angry about it. On the contrary, it would be strange if there was any conspiracy. The old man asked if he would really leave it alone, and the boy replied that he was just a squad leader and didn't care whether there was a spy or not. The old man gave an example of a ship. If it sinks, the passengers have no choice but to drown with it, and this problem will eventually come to the captain. Dylan said let it sink, it's not his, so it doesn't matter. On the territory of the main temple, the girl Jones sat by the memorial and prayed, then took a trident and showed several techniques to remind herself that she had not forgotten anything. She spun it like a spinning top and quickly cut through the air. Her fighting skills were fast and beautiful. She prepared to make the main blow, brought the trident behind her back, then kicked it up the hill, jumped as high as she could, caught the trident in the air and struck it. But after such a strong swing in the air, she could not hold on and landed on the ground with her feet and fell to the ground, throwing the trident out of her hands. She was still lying on the ground, tears were in her eyes, and she addressed her family with a trembling voice and said that the Metal Flag League was in danger. She got to her feet and spoke to her father. 10 long years had passed since his death. She had renounced her happiness and put all her strength into maintaining this league. But now this trident had become an unbearable burden for her. The league continues to lose to the Hague School. Putting the weapon back, she said that the league created by her father was now in the wrong hands. She asked for strength to protect the league, to protect her brother, who was now sitting on the second floor of the building, watching her and drinking alcohol. He looked at her with unsmiling eyes. The guys were carrying gifts to their league. Liam was carrying 4 barrels of alcohol and Noah was carrying 1 pig. They were chatting about something. The guy asked if it was surely enough for 30 people. Liam assured him that it was. But then Noah saw something and was horrified. The other guy asked what it was and he pointed his finger to the side, trying to say a word. Where Noah pointed, William's head was hanging on the spear with a sign that said, "Here hangs a traitor." Grover talked to Michael and said that even the dog was laughing at their decision. William was not a traitor, and Michael was silent, too. Suddenly, they heard screams from the street, went outside to check what had happened, and saw the celebration that Dylan had organized. The old man was roasting a pig, Noah was cutting up everything, Liam was developing drinks, and the rest of us who weren't doing anything were playing soccer. A girl from the Jones family came over to ask what was going on, and before she could say anything, the people switched to shouting for the captain. He took the ball and kicked it into the goal. They were running around like little kids. The girl was surprised by this behavior. They were wounded. How could they run like that? But the old man continued the conversation and said that it was good to be young. She asked if the wounds would open up if they exerted themselves so much, and he said that for the young and healthy, they would heal quickly and continued to watch the pig. The commanders were happy to see such a friendly and cheerful atmosphere among the team. Even Dylan's opponent came to this celebration. He threatened him in the interview. He had the ball. The opposing team started attacking him. One of them wanted to go to his feet, but he failed because he used his technique of X with quick steps. Dylan noticed it and could not remember who he saw. A few more opponents attacked him, and he avoided them again. Using the step technique, he quickly headed towards Dylan, who was already waiting for his opponent. And so they came to blows. The latter could think of nothing better than to throw a ball at Dylan's head. Of course, he dodged it, but the opponent did not stop there. He began to kick him en masse. Dylan had been dodging such attacks for his winnings, but he said he was impressed by the skill, and while he was talking he missed a punch and got hit in the side. When he stopped, he said he remembered where he had seen this technique. He asked if they were from the same school, but the man shouted at him to shut up and attacked him again as if he didn't want him to remember him. Everyone who was playing soccer with him stopped and watched them, and Liam ran up and asked if they were really going to start a fight. It turned out that he didn't want to stop the fight, but also wanted to show off, and Liam was not a threat to his opponent. He was punching so slowly that he didn't even need to strain to dodge. Ms. Jones approached the captains and offered to talk them out of fighting, but they just ignored her. Liam was exhausted from the constant attacks and praised his opponent for his quick response. When Dylan approached and asked if they had met in battle, he replied that he was no longer a student of the school and wanted to pay him back for the death of his uncle, which is why he hated Dylan so much.